Hello and welcome to this Intro to Sas video series for working with Sas on AU apps. This is video one of a three-part video series. Overall, we're going to discuss how to import data onto AU apps to work with Sas, talk about the Sas environment, edit and recode data, run different statistical tests, create some visualizations, and export output out of AU apps and onto the local machine. In video one, we're specifically going to talk about the overview of the scenario, overview of the Sas environment, how to load data into Sas on AU apps, the foundations of the Sas programming language, and obtain descriptive statistics on our dataset. So I'm going to go ahead and launch Sas on AU apps. You want to make sure you use the Horizon client. Do not use the browser. If you use the browser, you cannot download the dataset after you've cleaned it, nor the output. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And while that's launching, go ahead and have this open on the side, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the scenario. In this scenario, we're interested in studying the relationship of gross domestic product per capita, or GDP, PC, of a country and how well the country is doing for the economy, comparing that to how corrupt the country is. Specifically, for this question, data already exists. We're going to be using the World Development Indicators, or WDI, which is compiled annually by the World Bank. We're using data from a past year, and we have simplified the data set, but you can find the full data set on the World Bank website. We're also very lucky because World Bank saves the data there in a format that makes it easy to open and easy to get started with running analysis. Typically, though, when you find data set like old census data, it can take a lot of effort and time to transform the data into a usable format. And of course, there's never a guarantee that someone else has created the data set that you want in advance. Often, the first step in a research project is spending a lot of time looking at the values and the variables to create the data that you will need. Within the WDI dataset, we will focus on variables of corrupt and GDPPC. The first is an index of perceived corruption within a country's government. Citizens were surveyed and asked questions like, would you need to plan bribes to start a local business? These surveys were aggregated up to the country level. Note that corrupt is reverse coded, so higher scores equal lower corruption rates. The second variable is gross domestic product per capita, which indicates how well the economy is doing scaled for the population size of a country. For example, it might not be very interesting to note that Botswana produces less than Brazil overall, but it might be interesting to note that Botswana produces more per citizen than Brazil in 2014. Note that in using these variables from the WDI dataset, we've given responsibility of determining what corruption is and what quality of economy means to the World Bank. We have also allowed dynamic concepts and constructs to become simple numbers. However, this allows us to move quickly into the later stages of analysis, which has its advantages. So a little bit about the Sas environment. We're going to be using base Sas. We have our editor window, or program editor. This is a place where users enter programs and write programs for Sas procedures. It's equivalent to a state-of-do file or a syntax file of SPSS. You can run specific parts of the code by highlighting them in either pressing F5 or clicking on this run button that says submit. So it looks like the person that's running. We have the Explorer window on the left-hand side. This allows users to browse through active libraries and contents of the system. We have, if you click over on this tab in the lower left-hand side, this is the output tab. So all the output from the various procedures will be reported here. And we have the log file. This is going to be essentially where any sort of warnings or error messages come up in the process of processing Sas programs. Now, what I do first is we are going to go into our program editor. We're going to click on open. And you want to make sure that when you're opening things up, you don't want to use desktop documents, these, because that's actually the Azure Cloud ones. You want to make sure you're on your Z drive. That is your local machine. I have a copy of the Sas program and the dataset on my desktop on my local machine. I'm going to click on Z drive. I'm going to find desktop on the Z drive. And there is my Sas intro code. I'm going to click on it and then click on Open. This is what Sas code looks like. Whenever you see an asterisk, Sas knows that that is a comment. Whenever you have a line of code, you have a command, which is going to be in blue, information, which is going to be in black, and then any sort of file paths here. And every line has to end with a semicolon. This is one of the most common errors that I've seen, is forgetting to add a semicolon. So what we could potentially do is we can highlight code. So if I wanted to highlight this, I'm not actually going to run it though yet. And then I can click on the run option that will run it. So we have a proc command. Proc is short in Sas for procedures. A procedure is a collection of lines of code that carries out statistical analysis or data interpretations. Sas always has two sets of commands. There's always the data comments and then the procedures comments. You always have to have data ones first, because that's where you're going to be importing data. So procedures, we have the word proc followed by the name of the procedure. All statements included in the body of the procedure are there, and then it's finalized with a run statement. And then you have a semicolon. So we're going to talk a little bit about the data steps. So there's a couple ways you can import data. So you can import it using the import wizard, and then to do that, you go to File, Import Data. We have it in Excel. Click on Next. And so you click on Workbook. Then you can go through, and I'm actually going to use it a little bit differently. So if you wanted to, you can use the wizard. We're actually going to go ahead and use some code instead, though. So if you wanted to use the wizard, on the handout, we have the steps on how to do that. So again, you click File, Import Data, select comma separated values, click on Next. You point to the location of the file, click on this PC, then Z drive, and so forth. And then when you get to the member part, you type in Sas intro, and that would go ahead and import everything. For now, what I'm going to do is, because I have this on my desktop, I'm going to say what the file name is, the location. I'm saying import, and I'm going to create a Sas library. So actually, let's do that first. So I'm going to highlight this line of code here and run that. And now if we do import, so we can go ahead and, we need to do XLSX, and then it appears, and then you can go through the whole process again. We're not going to do that for now. We've already created our library, so essentially we've created an area we can hold everything. So we have our lib. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to import the data, saying what the data file is, what it's going to be called within Sas. It's going to be Sas intro.nations, and I'm saying it's an XLSX file type. So I'm going to highlight those lines of code. And there we know that it says, okay, there's now a data set with 217 observations of 13 variables. It was successful. And then how long it took. This looks great. So we've now imported the data. So what we're going to do now is we are going to, and actually, let me minimize this for a second because I want to show you something on my local machine's drive. So I'm going to hover it over here. On my local machine, there's now a Sas data file, nations, and that's where we're kind of pulling in. So it's actually created a local version of that data file on my machine in the background. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how to get descriptive statistics for one or more variables. A full description of all variables in the dataset can be obtained with the print/contents procedure. So what we're going to do is we're going to run proc print and saying what the dataset is, semicolon, run, semicolon. So we're saying run the procedure, print out the information with the dataset, and run it. So now it's actually in another test. We have our results viewer now. We have all of our countries. This is essentially our data set. So now we can actually see what everything looks like. And notice we have a lot of missingness here, all these dots. When we run statistical analysis, it's going to go ahead and omit those if it has missing. I'm going to go back into our editor, and let's say we wanted a specific subset of the data set. So I'm going to say first obs, so I want 6 to 11 for those observations. That's going to return just a subset of cases 6 to 11. Now you can also do contents, which gives you a little bit more information about the nature of the variables in there. So we have each of the variable names, the types, length, format, and if there's variable labels there too. We also have information about created and modified. We have maximum observations per page, number of observations, and so forth, and where the file is. So again, we're on the Z drive. Okay, so now what I do is we're going to create a table of basic descriptive statistics. We're using proc means. That's going to be kind of the default statistics. In var, by just saying var semicolon, we're saying, okay, all the variables in there. So all the variables that were numeric in nature, everything that was a character it omitted, but then we have our means, standard deviations, minimum, maximum, and number of observations. We can also, let's say we only wanted corrupt, GDPC, and literacy, and we wanted specifically the N, or samples for respondents, and the mean. If we only wanted those informations, we can highlight that and run it. And then we have the N and the mean for those 3 specific variables. Okay, this is going to conclude video 1. In the next video, we'll talk about how to recode and generate new variables.